right, y'all. So I've seen your request and I know what you want me to talk about. And you know what? I felt like there's a really easy way to make this happen. So it's the moment you've all been waiting for. We're about to talk about Motown. So for the next few weeks and maybe even month or two, we're going to be reminiscing on the relationships and marriages that have existed within the many artists, staff, and entities that were a part of the Black music history we call Motown Records. Now this means we'll be discussing Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5, the Isley Brothers, the Temptations, Gladys Knight, Stevie Wonder, and so much more. But we cannot discuss the zeitgeist of romance from that record label without discussing the founder that crafted it in the first place. So today we are seated in the pews to reflect on the one, the only Berry Gordy. He was married 3 times, had 8 children by 6 different women, but that was because Berry loves women. Like, he mentioned that, quote, women had been the inspiration of his life since childhood, and that notion definitely contributed to the love stories in his life. Soon, you're gonna see. Now, if you're new in the pews, I'll Tell You What is a weekly podcast that shares the weddings, marriages, and romances of notable Black figures throughout time. Now, we bask on these relationships to remind you of the passion in our past and to humanize the individuals we put on pedestals. Basically, it's all love Black history. And I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that tells you these stories every single Monday. Welcome to the 9th episode of I'll Tell You What. So first, I have to tell you about Berry Gordy and his first marriage. Now, way before Motown, but after Berry Gordy sent in the army during the Korean War, he met a woman named Thelma Coleman. Now, Thelma walked into Berry's record store with a friend and Berry's colleague, Billy Davis. Berry said she had a, quote, smooth, brown, flawless complexion and seemed, quote, shy and sweet. He said it wasn't long after that they began to date, and within a few months in 1953, they got married. Now, shortly after getting married, they wasted no time, and they were expecting their first child. Now, Berry really wanted a little boy, like a lot of men do, but became completely enamored when baby Hazel Joy came into the world in August 1954. She was named after Thelma's mother. Now, a little over a year later, in October 55, Thelma and Berry actually had another child, a little boy named Berry. And then 10 months after that, in August 1956, Thelma and Berry had another boy named Terry James. Because, dang, Berry couldn't get off Thelma, could he? So around the time he had these kids, he was pursuing a career as a songwriter. But to his in-laws and his wife, Loki, that meant he was a man with no job. His mother-in-law got him a job at the Ford Foundry where he'd work on a, quote, molten mixture of metal, coke, and limestone, which put him at risk of serious long-term health issues. He said after literally one day on the job, he would cough up, quote, black gook. His wrists would swell up and his body would ache. He told Thelma he couldn't do this anymore and she was disappointed. She felt like her mom went through the trouble of helping him find a job and he couldn't just quit after one day. She told him, quote, you can't embarrass me like this. So he would continue on that job for about 3 more weeks until his mother-in-law found him another job on an assembly line for Lincoln Mercury. Now, Berry loved this job and it was because it allowed him to also work on his songwriting career while being on the clock as well. He would also play poker to help bring in extra funds, which once led him to losing all his savings. Now, the success of his main job and his side gig allowed him to buy a 2-story house with 2 apartments on the top floor that he was able to rent out, therefore giving him a little bit of financial leeway, right? So with all this new stability, he decided it was time for him to quit his job so he could pursue his career of songwriting full time. Now, Thelma and her parents hated this idea, but he did it anyway. Ooh, child, can you imagine? He would spend his time writing songs and hanging around the Flame Show bar and other places where artists would be. It was through these circles that he would meet Al Green, who introduced him to another songwriter that Berry would end up working with, a guy named Raquel Billy Davis. Now, they would write for Al Green's artists, and Berry loved the feel that this career was finally bringing to him. But then, a fight with Thelma over their 4-year-old Hazel Joy would signal the true sentiments in his marriage. Berry wanted to take Hazel Joy to a friend's house, but Thelma said no because their toddler was sick and it was wet outside because the baby's not going outside. But when Berry found out that his mother-in-law was actually coming to take Hazel Joy, he intervened by grabbing her little wrist and telling Thelma, "I told you she's not going anywhere." Now, eventually, after the cries of his baby and her trying to get away from her father's grip, he let go. He ended up storming off and going to a broom closet where he sulked for about an hour. Now, a few days afterwards, there was some awkward tension between Thelma and Berry, and eventually he was served divorce papers. Now, he didn't say a word to Thelma about this. He just packed up his clothes and would stay at the homes of his sisters Gwen and Lucy. But, you know, he wouldn't be alone for long. Now, Berry Gordy would meet his second wife at work. Time would go by and different aspiring artists would come to him to audition in hopes of being able to record on his sister's record label, Anna Records. Now, a pair of sisters would actually come to audition, Alice and Raynoma. Berry said these two didn't impress him, but he liked them. Raynoma would come back the next day to help out wherever and however was needed. They had a good working relationship that continued after he started Tamla Records, the first name of what we now know would become Motown. Then Berry was living and working out of his sister's place, so Raynoma suggested that he move in with her since she had a 3-room apartment for her and her 3-year-old son. And he was like, okay, sure, yeah, that works. Now, staying with Raynoma also meant that he slept in the same bed with her. But you know, that was his homie, his coworker. But obviously it didn't take them long to need to get a bigger apartment as they upgraded their relationship from friends to friends with bennies. Now, by the fall of 1958, Berry and Raynoma were expecting their first child. Their son, Carrie, was born on June 25th, 1959. Now, also around this time, Berry's divorce to Thelma was finally finalizing. Despite his new family he was creating with Raynoma, he was pretty good on marriage. Like, he didn't want to do that again. Now, meanwhile, Raynoma was getting anxious and wanted to make this thing legit. So, sometime later, after the 4 of them had moved into another home, which then would serve as the headquarters for Motown, Raynoma told him one day that, quote, "We get married next Thursday." Now, Berry didn't pay much mind to this until next Thursday actually came, and they were in the car with both of their parents headed 60 miles to Ohio to get married. Now, on the ride there, he started to panic. He didn't want to get married, and definitely not this way. He whispered to himself, "I'm not getting married." But in a silent car, everybody heard that. He told Robert Bateman, the one that was driving the car, to turn around when they were about 15 miles out. So Robert did, and they all rode back in silence. Now, 3 days later, while Raynoma was brushing her teeth, Berry proposed. Perhaps he wanted this to be on his terms, or maybe he just realized how much Raynoma meant to his life, or both. Regardless, Robert would then drive them to Ohio, and this time they would actually get married in 1960. Now, the more popular he became, the more women were drawn to him. While Raynoma, quote, was always there for him, that didn't stop him from entertaining a woman named Margaret Norton. Berry said, quote, "She was the most beautiful girl in Detroit." But regardless of his affair with Margaret, he realized, quote, how wonderful his own wife was. Because Raynoma was the type of wife that didn't ask questions. Like, her only request was that he be home by 6 a.m., which was something he would do, even if he only made it in with 5 minutes to spare. Now, in his biography, he mentioned once how he got into this argument with Margaret and broke up with her, and then went home around like 1 a.m. Now, when he got home and slipped into bed, he realized that Raynoma wasn't there, but he didn't think much of it because he assumed that she was still at work. So when then he woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed she still wasn't in bed, he started to panic. Like, what's going on? Where is she? So he called the studio to find out that she had actually left about 5 hours earlier. So then he decided to go sit in the car parked outside and just let his mind drive him insane. Like, he called the hospital. She wasn't at the hospital, which made him feel good, but also made him feel bad. So it was like, where could she be for real? So at 5 5:30 a.m., Raynoma pulls up with her assistant. Now, at this time, Berry is pissed, right? Like, hot. He asked her where she had been, and she said she went to the movies with her assistant and her nephew. And so Berry was like, okay. And then he started to think about it. And then a little bit later, he started to hear that actually Raynoma was having an affair with some man in New York. Now, trying to get her to confess, he was like, well, you know, I actually been having an affair with Margaret, blah, 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 boom, boom, boom. And she was like, yeah, I knew that. And you know what? Actually, me too. Me too. Like, yeah, so the guy in New York, yeah, that's what it was. And that time at the that didn't happen. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And you have to know that Berry was upset, pissed off. The man that was cheating to be cheated on. The audacity. How dare she? Berry said, quote, if she wanted to hurt me, she did. I left the house that night walking and crying alone in the rain. Okay, big morning Juice Jones energy, wasn't it? Don't touch that coat. All right, anyway, so not wanting to drag this out, in 1962, they had a Mexican divorce through the mail. You know, that's what all the celebrities were doing back in the day. Now, she would take their son Carrie with her and move to New York, and she actually continued to work for him. And you know, Berry, he was fine because another relationship would give him his fifth child very, very soon. So after Berry Gordy's divorce to his second wife, Raynoma, he began a relationship to another woman named Gina Jackson. Now, she was a native of Hartford, Connecticut, but moved to Detroit in 1963. She was working in administrative roles, mostly for Motown, until the head of sales, Barney Ailes, asked her to join his team. Berry said their relationship was very brief, but brought about their daughter, Sherry. Now, all of this happened while he was also entertaining Margaret on and off. They would have a child in March 1964 named Kennedy William, named after the recently assassinated President Kennedy and friend and colleague Smokey Robinson. Now later we would all go on to know this child as Rockwell, the singer behind the 1984 song Somebody's Watching Me. Now as time went on, and honestly around the time one of his biggest artists, Mary Wells, was about to start a legal battle to get out of her contract, Berry got noticed that the Mexican divorce to Raynoma actually didn't go through. He was still married. And this news actually came through 2 years after he thought the divorce was finalized. Like, did nobody check this up? Nobody got a receipt? I don't know. But anywho, not only did he learn that he wasn't divorced to Raynoma, but actually would find out that she was bootlegging copies of Mary Wells's My Guy. Now, they would arrest her and she spent 1 day behind bars. She called him from jail and told him she did it because she needed some quick money. Now, he felt bad for her, so he didn't press charges, but they did move forward with the actual dissolving of their marriage, which meant finally being done for good. Now, there was a time where Raynoma did kind of feel ill towards Berry. This was when she wrote a book in 1990 about her time at Motown and her relationship and marriage to him. I just want y'all to know, I wanted to actually buy and read this book, but it was barely available, and the versions I did find were used and were like at least $60 and would take over a week to arrive, so that didn't happen. Later, Berry felt like she wrote it because she felt like she was another unsung hero of Motown and didn't quite get her flowers, so he really wanted to make up for it by doing so in his own biography. He also wrapped their story by saying that they were, quote, closer than ever until she passed away in 2016 from brain cancer. Raynoma would actually remarry, but Berry's next relationship would probably be his most notable one, his relationship to Miss Diana Ross. So the woman that would probably have the biggest impact on Berry Gordy's life came to him when she was just 16 years old. Now, this was back in 1960 when Berry was 31 and still married to his second wife, Raynoma. This girl quartet called the Primettes came in to audition. One of the girls in the group was the neighbor of Smokey Robinson, and she asked him to help them get a chance at Motown. They came in and didn't particularly wow Berry, but later he would actually bring them back to audition as backup singers for another one of his artists. Now, during that test, Smokey Robinson's neighbor, the 16-year-old I was telling y'all about, was actually this really skinny teenager named Diana Ross. Now, she would visibly flirt with Berry during this test, according to the other people in the room, so much so that Berry was caught off guard. Like, he's almost twice her age. Like, a few weeks in, he decided to sign the group. They changed their name to the Supremes under the request from Berry, and they worked in various capacities until Berry started to take more of an interest in the group altogether. Now, all those years working so closely with the girls made Berry start to develop feelings for Diana. This began around 1963 or 1964, sometime around the time when basically Diana was approaching or in her early 20s. Now, the feeling was very mutual though. Quote, "He was funny too. He made her laugh. She loved his drive and ambition, which mirrored her own." Also, in their own friendship and relationship, they would affectionately call each other Black. Now, in 1964, after this Motown tour in Europe wrapped, Diana asked Berry to stay 2 days longer with her. Now, he was like, hold up, wait a minute, is it about to happen? Now, this would be like a 2-day date for them that would actually start with the hiccup of impotence, but would ultimately wrap with them making love for the first time before heading back to the States. And yes, I said making love because I do want to bring that back. Berry said they tried to keep their relationship under wraps, but eventually it became very apparent to the other artists and staff at Motown. Like, in the years afterwards, Berry would actually walk a very fine line between being her boyfriend and being her boss. He allowed Diana to get away with things that Mary and Flo just couldn't, and there was obvious favoritism, which would naturally piss the other two off. And at one point, when Mary and Flo were starting to feel like Diana was better than them, Berry sat them all down and reminded them that they were all friends and they all made the same amount of money. So despite who sang lead, despite who did what, y'all are all good homies, right? Like, y'all all good friends. But realistically, they weren't really friends. They were just like really like co-workers that were kind of forced to try to be friends. While Mary and Flo saw Diana as the favorites, this was really crumbling under pressure. One time they were performing in Boston and Diana had a breakdown. She said there was this pressure in her head. Now, Florence and Mary comforted her, and the next day Berry actually flew up and canceled the rest of their shows. Diana went back home to Detroit and was admitted into the hospital for, quote, exhaustion. Now, Florence would go visit her and could tell that she was overwhelmed with the pressure that was being put on her, and even hinting towards a possible move for Diana to go solo. Like, this is probably about to happen, right? Now, the two of them would cry together, as this was probably another example of the writing on the wall of what was about to become the future of the Supremes, but also hint at the weight of the power dynamic between Diana and Berry and what it was doing to her. She always claimed that not only was Berry basically like her mentor, but also a father figure too. So imagine being in love or at least intimate with someone who feels like your dad, but also cuts your checks. It's not a good move. And she would learn that. Now, around the time that Flo got fired from the Supremes because she was drinking too much and gaining too much weight, Diana became somewhat of a dramatic diva increasingly, and allegedly. And while most of this was due to the ascension of her career, all of that could be tied back to Berry. She'd take her frustration out on her bandmates and almost anyone that was close by. Her mom even clocked this. Now, this realization made Diana cry because this relationship was actually proving itself to be emotionally toxic. So consider that frame of mind when we move forward to 1969. Diana was in a department store looking for a gift when she was drawn to this tall glass of milk. She approached him to learn that his name was Bob Ellis Silberstein. Now, he was a teacher and she kind of liked what she was getting off him. So they went on a few dates and she was starting to feel feelings. Her friends that were even privy to this relationship liked how her demeanor was softening and how the air around her felt just less tense. This was looking really promising, but would it truly be? Now, after a few good dates with Bob, Diana Ross decided to end what was a very hopeful beginning because of the time and emotions invested into Berry Gordy. You know how sometimes we rather hold on than let go because we've come so far? Yeah. So according to biographer J. Randy Taraborelli, quote, after she left the Supremes, most people in Diana's inner circle assumed it would be an ideal time for her and Berry to get married. Now, even the press was asking about the possibility of them walking down the aisle. Berry would tell Ebony magazine that he, quote, tried to marry her a couple of times and, quote, why should she marry me when she got me anyway? But while he was saying this, allegedly, Berry was entertaining other women. Now, one of these relationships that caused actually a lot of headache in his relationship was his relationship with this woman named Chris Clark, a white girl that recorded at Motown with a good voice but actually no commercial success. It was as if around this time Diane really wanted him to prove that she alone was enough. Now, reflecting back, Berry said, quote, we both recognized that my role had become too defined, too demanding, and too unyielding to exist in a loving marriage. And Diane would say, quote, although he had focused so much attention on me throughout my career, I never felt that he was serious about me as a woman or a prospective wife. I wasn't even his girlfriend, at least he never called me that. But he used whatever he could think of to keep me under his wing. As Berry and Diane's relationship was coming to an end, he became reconnected with his fourth child, Carrie. Berry didn't initially recognize him because it had been 6 years since he had last seen his kid, but hugged him deeply after it connected. This also reconnected him to his ex-wife Raynoma, and she would begin to work at Motown again, but this time as Diana Ross's travel assistant. This did not thrill Diana. Quote, even though they had ended their romance, it was as if Berry was still the puppet master, pulling her strings in every direction at will, and now even causing her to have to face his ex-wife in an already stressful work environment, said J. Randy Taraborelli, the author of Diana Ross's biography. When Diana and Berry broke up, she actually spun the block and called Bob up, and Bob was still feeling the kid. But you know what? The chokehold that was on Berry and Diana wasn't completely over yet. On Christmas Eve 1970, after they had both made efforts to move on and move forward, or at least that's what they said, they slipped back into old habits and made love one more time. Now, a month later, the news would break that Diana and Bob eloped in Vegas. Berry would find out about the wedding a few days afterwards through Suzanne DePass, a Motown executive that was also Diana's friend. By him being absolutely distraught, he would take Chris Clark on an impromptu vacation to Bermuda to try to get his mind off of it. A few weeks later, Diana would actually announce that she was ding, 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 expecting her first child. Now, people would begin to speculate who was the daddy and if this was the reason why Diana rushed to get married to Bob. Bob always knew what was what and that this child wasn't his, but he was determined to not be a stepfather, but in fact be the father that stepped up. You see, Bob walked so Russell Wilson could run. So her pregnancy occurred while she was working on the movie Lady Sings the Blues, and her delivery did too. On August 14th, 1971, Diana went into labor and both Bob and Berry were at the hospital awaiting the delivery. After the successful childbirth, Diana and Bob would send out announcements sharing the news of their new baby girl, Rhonda Suzanne Silberstein. Now, by the time Berry shot Mahogany, he was dating a woman named Nancy Leviska for about a year. And by September 1975, Nancy and Berry had their son and Berry's 8th and final child, Stefan. Now, we would know Stefan later as Red Foo from the duo LMFAO. When it was time to edit Mahogany, though, their relationship basically came to an end. But Berry said, like his relationship with all his exes, they would remain the best of friends, quote. Now, years later, Diana would actually become cool with Nancy. When her contract with Motown was expiring and she was considering her options, Diana talked this over with Nancy. Diana was, I guess, seeming to have a little bit of imposter syndrome about her possible success outside of Motown, a place she had spent over 2 decades. She gave Berry a lot of credit for her success, and Nancy quickly reminded her that it was the both of them, not just him. Like, ma'am, you are Diana Ross. Don't you forget that. Now, Nancy told her, quote, "Don't underestimate yourself and what you've done with your life. This is business as much as it is personal." Now, it took her a little while to decide on what she would do, but in December of 1990, Diana told Berry, not Black, that she was indeed leaving Motown. And because she said Berry, he knew she wasn't playing. After that, she got a $20 million 7-year deal with RCA that following March. But a few years later, shortly after Diana's mama, Ernestine, passed away, she decided it was actually time to tell her daughter the truth. Now, at this point, Rhonda was 13 years old. Rhonda also around this time was starting to put two and two together. Like, she was starting to notice the difference between her and her two younger sisters, Tracy and Chutney. She was like, I'm dark, they light, I'm short, they tall. Like, then Diana finally just came forward and told her, like, all right, look, this is what it is. Because you see, according to her little brother Chico, Diana always wanted to be a mom and was really starting to think like maybe it wasn't going to happen for her. But then when she found out that she was pregnant with Rhonda, she was so excited and wanted to rush to tell Berry despite their relationship basically ending. But when she discovered that he was dating her op, Chris Clark, she was disappointed and basically hurt. So she kept the news to herself. And when he learned that she was pregnant about 6 weeks after the fact from the last time they had sex, he was like, let me math this, and he mathed right. So shortly after Diana told her daughter the truth, both Diana and Rhonda ran into Berry on the set of shooting The Last Dragon. Diana pulled him aside and confided in him that Rhonda knew. Now, throughout the years, Berry was actually in the lives of Diana's children. They knew him as Uncle BB. They spent time at each other's homes, and he was seen as an extension of their family. So after Rhonda learned the truth about her father, the two of them actually went to eat alone the next day, and a true father-daughter relationship actually began to form between them. Years later, she said she wasn't surprised to learn that he was her dad, and in fact, she feels like she looked more like him than her mother. What do you think? Well, at this stage of his life, according to some, Berry was less sociable than he was before. Some felt like Diana was the one that got away, and he never really forgave himself for it, but Rhonda gave him something much more. Now, the biographer J. Randy Tara Borelli wrote this sentiment I felt perfectly. Quote, "Berry finally had something he always wanted, a deep and undeniable link to Diana. He and Diana had created so much together. Now, with the truth revealed, Berry would say he felt his place in Diana's life was somehow more real. She may have tried to push aside her connection to him, but Berry's love for her never faded. And now, no one could deny it or take it away from him. He and Diana were, without question, family." Now, though some would have assumed that maybe Berry would never marry again, they would be wrong, because he would get married one more time. Now, in the early 1980s, Berry Gordy began to date a woman of Asian descent named Grace Eaton. They would go together for 8 years before getting married in Santa Barbara, California on July 17, 1990. Their wedding ceremony took place at First United Methodist Church, and the reception took place at the Coral Casino at the Four Seasons Biltmore in Santa Barbara. She wore an off-the-shoulder ball gown with a sweetheart neckline and what looks like tulle sleeves and a very large tulle skirt. And Berry wore a typical tuxedo. Now, Smokey Robinson and Melvin Franklin of The Temptations both performed at the wedding. And as you would expect, they had a plethora of celebrity guests, including Lionel and Brenda Ritchie, which, yes, we'll be discussing them later. Michael Jackson, which I already told y'all we'll be discussing him later. Hugh Hefner, and Berry Gordy's ex, Diana Ross. Almost 3 years later, in the summer of 1993, Berry would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. It was documented that they had been separated for about 2 months as of the timing of the filing. There was a prenuptial agreement in place, but the details of that were not disclosed. Now, there isn't much else that is publicly known or available about Grace Eaton. And that, my friends, wraps the many love stories of Berry Gordy. Now, as always, if you want to learn more about anything I discuss, check out the resources linked in the notes below. All right, some news before we wrap. So there won't be any show notes this week, and honestly for a minute, because I actually want to retool it. If you remember the video I did on Steven and Alexis back in early June, I think that's kind of what I want show notes to become. But if you want to share your love stories or wedding stories with us, definitely fill out the form below. As always, don't forget to subscribe and follow us everywhere. If you enjoy listening to your podcast instead of watching, subscribe to I'll Tell You What wherever you can. And yeah, some of y'all have been asking how can I support the show. You could definitely do so by going to IsleTell.com. That is AISLETELL.com. But also, if you want to help with maybe like some of the books or some of the purchases of the show, I will link to my Amazon shopping list so you can kind of help with some of maybe the books and stuff for some of these future episodes. So I appreciate it in advance. And you know, if you want to collaborate, advertise, chat, holla at your girl, definitely email me at isle@hueido.com. That is AISLE@HUEIDO.com. And if you're looking for me, if you want to follow me, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Demitash, which is DEMITASHE. Or if you're on Spill, you can find me at Ashley, which is ASHLEIGH. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, I'm on Threads. I'll Tell You What is now on Threads. I can only handle so much. As I kind of briefly mentioned, because we just covered Berry Gordy, it makes sense for us to next dive into Diana Ross and the Supreme. So we're going to be going into that next week. I truly appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much for coming back every single week. And I hope to see you in the pews.